This episode of Where Did the Road Go is brought to you in part by our Patreons. If you want to become a patron, go to wheredidtheroadgo.com. And now our show.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Soraya.
Welcome to this edition of Where Did the Road Go? Tonight, we're going to be talking the tarot with Robert Bonomo, who has a documentary on YouTube that you can check out for free. And it's broken into parts, or it's one solid piece, depending on how you want to watch it. So we'll be talking about that and how to find that during the show. I'd like to give a special thanks out to Dominic O'Malley, Bradley Doobie, and Dennis Quinn for some very generous donations to the show. Thank you so much, guys. And there's also merchandise available, and I never mentioned this, but there are shirts and all kinds of other stuff, both from Store Envy and TeePublic. If you go to wheredidtheroadgo.com, there's links to all that stuff. And yeah, I guess that's it for right now. We have an extra Patreon segment with Robert after this interview, so patrons will get that as well. If you want to become a patron, it's only $3 a month. And again, wheredidtheroadgo.com will get you there. Thank you, everyone, for the support. You're an amazing audience. You seriously are. And I am still taking submissions for strange experiences in the woods. I've gotten a bunch so far, but keep them coming. Stories at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Send me your strange encounters in the woods, and we'll either have you on to talk about it or we'll discuss it however you prefer. And that's it. Here's my conversation with Robert Bonomo. All right, I am joined here by Robert Bonomo. And how are you doing, Robert?
Really well. Doing really well tonight. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. You have this this documentary that we're going to talk about in a minute, but tell people a little bit about yourself.
So I've always been into writing. So I in my early 20s I started writing novels. And of course the first one was horrible, but then I kept writing. But I also had a career in advertising. So it was kind of interesting to have sort of the artistic side with the writing the novels, and on the other side I worked in online marketing for banks, agencies, that kind of stuff. So I kind of have that sort of artistic and also advertising background. And I've lived in a lot of different places. That's, I think, one thing that's probably a little interesting about my background.
Yeah, you have on your bio, you have a whole list from, all over the world.
Yeah, and because for me, I like to travel, but I find it, I don't know, I think what's happened with traveling now is we've seen so many places, and we've visually been so many, that I like to go to a place and live. Actually live, get a job, work, and feel out the place. So I've actually lived and worked in a whole bunch of different countries. Argentina, I was in Spain, China, Russia. So I've been to a bunch of places.
Huh. Okay. And what made you decide to do a documentary on the tarot?
Yeah, because when you get into, for example, in astrology or alchemy, and of course all the religious movements, there's a lot of fundamental texts. But I think tarot kind of is missing that one key text that we can kind of go to and there are many cookbooks out there about tarot. But in my opinion, the tarot, there's actually a path to it. It's more than just 22 archetypes. It's actually explaining a way to kind of wake up. And I don't think there was anything definitive out there in a book, and definitely not in a film. And I've always been fascinated by film. I think if you watch the documentary, you'll see I use a lot of classic films. So I've always loved film. So I said, let me give it a shot as a film to kind of show this path through the major arcana, but with film, so that you can give the actual feeling of what each archetype is, and also get a sense of the journey through, the fool's journey. So that was the real goal. And I had written a novel where the narrative arc is the major arcana, And then I wanted to do something that wasn't fiction. So that's really why I did the novel. I mean the documentary.
And the documentary is the first nonfiction thing you've done, right? As far as long form?
Yeah, as far as long form, absolutely. Because I've done lots of articles. I've written lots of articles. I've been published in a lot of different places. Because I've written on finance, politics, esoteric things. But this is the first long form thing I've done that's nonfiction.
Okay. So let's get into the origin of the tarot, because there's a lot of haze over that a lot of times, and you seem to have cut through most of that and looked down to what's really going on with this.
Yeah, there is a lot of haze, but I think if you really dig, and it's not that I've done anything original of research on this. This was all pretty well established. That the major arcana of the tarot. So just so if folks aren't familiar with the tarot, there's 78 cards. There's 56 minor arcana. Those 56 minor arcana are basically very similar to the playing cards we use today. But in Renaissance Italy, or late medieval period, early Renaissance, somebody added these 22 cards to what was a game. And that's what my documentary is about. And the 22 major arcana, for folks, it's, for example, the Hanged Man, the Magician, the Fool, those 22 cards. Those are what we call the major arcana. And that's what the documentary is about. And that's what I think is actually most interesting about the tarot.
Yeah, and I do too. I mean, there's been a lot of different interpretations on how this stuff plays out, but treating that as a story I've always enjoyed. And you kind of put a Gnostic twist on it.
Absolutely. And that's key. So I'm sorry, I don't think I answered your question. So where did they come from? Basically, this was a game from the Mamluks who ruled Egypt. And this game probably moved into Europe in the 1200s, 1300s, somewhere around there. And then in Renaissance Italy, this would be right around 1400. That's when the 22 major arcana were added as part of the game. So it was just another layer of the game, another layer of complexity to the game. So that's where that's where it comes from. And initially it was, I'm sure it was a game. But the Gnostic part for me, because I would consider, I come from that sort of Gnostic background. That's where I would say that's where my my ideas are I'm most comfortable with. And there is that one element of the Cathars. So the Cathars were a Gnostic sect in the south of France and the north of Italy in the 1200s. And then there was a crusade. There was actually a crusade against them. And so they were basically wiped out by the end of the by the end of the 1200s. They were completely wiped out. And I have a feeling that there's some connection between the tarot and the Cathars. I can't prove it, and I'm hoping that there's some PhD students out there, somebody who'll grab onto this and really dig in and see if there's any way that there's a connection. But I insinuate in the film that at least it's a possibility. So yeah, I feel that there, and I also am convinced, and I think there's more evidence for this, that the ideas of alchemy, especially with the imagery, I think in the film I compare some alchemic texts from that period and the original cards, and the similarities I think are pretty strong.
Yeah. Yeah, and alchemy ran through so much stuff back then, we just weren't aware of it when we look at that stuff.
Exactly. And alchemy has such a strange history. I mean, until Jung, I think it was almost forgotten. It was almost like some crazy relic of the past. But I think, especially with Carl Jung, it sort of reemerged again. Reemerged as, that maybe there's something deeper in this. And what Jung's idea was alchemy was a connection back to the Gnostics, the Hellenistic Gnostics. It was sort of a midway point. And that's why, when you talk about an alchemic influence on the tarot cards, then you're really, in a sense, indirectly, it's a Gnostic influence.
Now you use the Rider-Waite deck. Did you pick that one because it's the most popular, or do you have a special affinity for that one?
Yeah, I would say basically I used it because one, it's the most popular, and I think when you're learning the tarot, it's probably the easiest. I think basically because of the minor arcana. So if you're trying to learn the tarot cards for divination, I think it's much because the Marseille deck is beautiful. I love the Marseille decks, but when you have to learn the meaning of the cards without any kind of an image, so if it's just, for example, 10 swords. I think it's much more difficult to learn. So that's why I use really the Rider-Waite. And I think Pamela Coleman-Smith, I think she did a great job. I love those illustrations.
Oh, yeah.
She did a great job.
Yeah. And there's so many tarot decks out there now, it's ridiculous. Because there's just tarot decks for everything.
Yeah. There's too many, I think. It's just become absurd.
What do you think of the way Crowley changed the deck?
Some of the things he changed I actually like with for example, temperance. I think, didn't he call that art? Some of his cards, isn't that? Yeah, like some of those, adjustment,
one of the two.
Yeah, for some reason, one of those two. But yeah, I like some of those cards. But I think that the Rider-Waite-Smith deck is more, it's more connected to the traditional decks. And I'm basically pretty conservative, so I think, if you're gonna, it's like in astrology. I think it's much easier to learn Hellenistic astrology and then add on the new stuff. But I think it's important to learn really the basic astrology, what it was originally, and then you can add on the modern stuff. I think if you start, for example, with 20th century astrology and try and move your way back, it can get really confusing. So I think with the tarot, especially if people are new to it, it's easier to start with the Rider-Waite-Smith deck because it's much closer to the Marseille deck than the Thoth deck is.
Okay, all right. I do like the way Crowley changed the deck. I mean, he put so many more correspondences into everything too, but I can see how it might take out some of the original meaning that you kind of put forth in this documentary.
Right. Like imagine if somebody wanted to do my film on a film like I did on the Crowley deck, it would be a completely different film. But it would be a fascinating film, but it would be completely different.
Yes.
So I think you got to have to choose your battles. And that would be an entirely different battle. but I think it would be a really fascinating, to see someone take a different look at it,
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about duality. And I mean, my way of looking at duality has always been that you need some kind of duality in order to process reality. Like you need like if everything was red, you wouldn't see color.
Exactly.
You need that contrast. You need some sort of duality in order to process what we exist in.
Yeah, I mean, in the film, I think I actually say, duality is the landscape, and consciousness is the light on it. But without duality, the whole idea of transcending duality, I mean, I understand what people mean in a spiritual sense, but what I think there's a little bit of confusion on is, can you actually transcend duality, or can you expand your awareness, which is move through duality? But is there really a singularity? Now, I don't think there is, and I think that's missing the point. I think there's a real problem when we talk about transcending duality, because a lot of people think, well, I'm going to reach this point, that singular point where there is no duality, and I'll be enlightened. That's a mistake, because you're never going to reach that point.
Right.
You'll reach a point where you're more enlightened and more aware, but then what you're moving on to a different landscape where that duality continues. And I think it can be very frustrating, because people think, well, I haven't gotten there yet, but you're never going to get there, and you shouldn't look for that.
Yeah, well,
at least that's the way
I don't think you can get there in this existence. I think this existence requires some level of duality.
And probably the next one.
Yeah. Very possibly. Yeah.
I mean, because there is a very old idea and it's a very Gnostic idea, that what is existence? It's God, in a sense, trying to become aware of himself.
Mm-hmm.
So it's actually this folding where you begin to see, but will you ever reach the end? And when you bring math into this, and the idea of infinities, and then infinities that are bigger than infinities, and that kind of thing,
right,
you get the sense that maybe there really isn't an end. That's the way I like to look at it. And I find that more comfortable. And my spiritual experiences have kind of pushed me in that direction.
Yeah, mine too. I think that it's like our existence, we may all be part of, the all that is, God, whatever you want to call it. But I think it's not only seeking to understand itself, but it's seeking to create something new.
Yeah, that's interesting. Is it just trying to become more aware, or is it actually creating? Yeah, that's almost above my pay grade, that question.
Well, let's talk a little bit about archetypes. So I'll explain to people what archetypes are exactly and how they fit into this whole puzzle.
Yeah, and defining archetypes is not easy, and it's something I've thought about a lot. And how I would like to begin to talk about them is the fundamental archetype. If there's one fundamental archetype, it's number. And so when we think about archetypes, it's almost like the DNA of the universe. It's that original form from which everything emerges. And if you look at it just on a mathematical sense, I think it becomes more clear because, for example, if you ask physicists what exactly are numbers, they generally avoid the question, and they'll say, well, ask the mathematicians. We just know it works. And when you get to sort of the pure mathematicians, there are different schools, but an incredibly large amount of them are Platonists. If you push them, they will say numbers do exist. And from these numbers, the forms of our universe emerge. Physics works. I know some people don't like physics, but it works. You know what I mean? I don't want to go there. Yeah. So, but you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
And so the numbers work, but what exactly are they? There's some kind of primal form that exists somewhere. And now, if we expand that out of number, like in the film, I use the tetractys a lot. The Pythagorean form of the tetractys. And it's interesting because that's just a triangle of numbers. You go from 1, and then below it, there are 2 numbers, 2 and 3, right? But those numbers begin to tell a story of a singularity that becomes a duality, that becomes 3. That's kind of consciousness. And then from that comes the 4, which is 4 is the physical world, right? The 4 seasons, the 4 directions, the 4 elements, and all that. So if we move from numbers to actually forms in the sense of, for example, the masculine and the feminine, number 2 and 3, 2 would be the feminine, 3 would be the masculine. You begin to see how from number emerge these forms, the mother, all these archetypes, no? So they actually, I at least from the Platonic sense, they actually exist just like numbers exist. And it's from these forms that things emerge. And I try and touch that in the film. I use, for example, like the Virgin. Like where does she come from? Is this just something that the Catholics invented? No, this comes from way, way back. And you can go as far back as you want, and you will see these feminine forms that were almost like goddesses. Mm-hmm. And then in modern times, we see them in Hollywood. You see them all over the place,
True.
And I think in my film, I use a Chanel ad. You see this woman coming, like lying in bed. She like lifts the sheet up, and she looks like a goddess. So we're constantly falling back on these archetypes. In politics, when you see, the president with the planes and the soldiers and all this, I mean, it's obviously something very similar to the emperor, no?
Mm-hmm.
So they're all over the place.
And it was really Jung who brought out a lot of this stuff.
He did, and he modernized it.
Yeah.
In the sense where, I mean, it had been around for a long time, but he put it in psychological terms and sort of modern 20th century psychological terminology that people could accept. Because let's face it, psychology is not a science. I mean, there's no science in Freud or in Jung or any of these people. What they're studying really is mythology.
Yeah.
And so it's almost like applied mythology, but they call it a science. So yeah, I mean, I think Jung was very smart because he knew if he stayed in that psychology lane, he would be considered more 20th century, more modern. But then you look at the Red Book, and you say, you understand why he didn't publish that in his lifetime.
I'm not familiar with the Red Book. What's that?
Oh, yeah, this is really interesting. When Jung had his split with Freud in 1912, 1913, he had a really difficult period, almost like a psychotic break. And he created a book. It's called the Red Book. And it's his sort of active imagination, but he's used all sorts of mythological figures. And he wrote this book, the Red Book. And he would not publish it in his lifetime. And it was finally published in 2012, I believe. And it caused a big stir, because the famous Red Book that people had talked about, we could finally read. And you see that Jung really was not a psychologist. He was a Gnostic mystic. That's really what he was, masquerading as a psychologist. And he was very smart to do that because, I mean, he was taken seriously. I mean, look at the difference between how Steiner is considered and how Jung is considered. You don't hear that much about Steiner, but you hear a lot about Jung. And I think that's because Jung went down the psychology lane.
All right. So let's talk about the cards a little. Let's talk about in brief form. Maybe we can kind of deal with this journey from the Fool down to the World. And the Fool is kind of a liminal card to start off.
Right, and it's really important that the Fool eventually winds up with that number 0, which doesn't really mean anything in esoteric terms. The 0 is not. I mean, 0 is an accounting term, but in spiritual esoteric thought, 0 was something that the Pythagoreans didn't use 0. And when you think about 0 from a kind of a mystic point of view, it's kind of a difficult concept to get around. But when you're doing accounting, when you're counting money, you definitely need it.
Right.
So yeah, I see the Fool as the one who's taking the journey. And I use a lot kind of a triangle image. So I put 7 cards, 7 cards, and 7 cards, the 21 cards in a triangle, and the Fool in the middle. So it's the Fool's journey, but he's also kind of a reflection of the macrocosm. He's kind of the microcosm. And he's created out of these archetypes.
Okay. And he I had another question about the Fool, and I've completely forgotten it. Let's move on to the Magician.
Sure. So if we think of the Fool as he kind of meets the Magician, and I see the Magician, you can see him in many ways, but in a lot of ways as an alchemist. So what's the first stage in alchemy is you cook the lead, right? And the Fool gets cooked, and he gets separated into his 4 parts. And remember, you see, how the Magician on that table, he always has the 4 elements. He's got the sword, the cup, the wand, and the pentacle: earth, air, fire, and water. And so he breaks the Fool up into those 4 elements. And that's where you get the next 4 cards. The 2 feminine elements in the High Priestess and the Empress, and then the 2 masculine elements in the Emperor and the Hierophant. So the High Priestess would be more water, the Empress would be more earth, the Emperor definitely more fire, and the Hierophant more air. So it's sort of like taking the Fool and just breaking him up into those 4, the four fundamental his 4 fundamental parts.
Hmm.
And that's why those first 7 cards, from the Magician to the Chariot, that's definitely the material level. And that's a very Gnostic concept, that there are sort of material people, there are psychic people, and there are spiritual people, no?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
When you're on that first level of cards, I see that definitely as the material plane.
I can see that. But would a politician fall under the Hierophant as well as the Emperor?
Yeah, that's a great question. It depends on the politician, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think in the film with the Hierophant, I use like a Jefferson as more sort of a Hierophant. But maybe, someone like Kennedy was more of an emperor.
Hmm.
So it depends on what emerges from. Is it law? Is it constitutions, dogma, these kinds of things, or is it just that leadership ability?
What? Where would you place the Virgin archetype? Would that be under the High Priestess?
Absolutely. I definitely see the Virgin in the Catholic sense is definitely much more High Priestess. The Empress is much more Venus. I see here is very associated because, there are associations with the cards, and there's tons of books out there that'll tell you, this card means that. I'm not sure that when the cards were created, because, archetypes don't equal something. If you're dealing with a true archetype, you can't put an equal sign there.
Right.
Exactly what does the Virgin mean? That's extremely complicated. But the Empress is pretty close to Venus.
Okay.
Both sides of Venus. Because in modern terms, Venus has become sort of more like a goddess of beauty. But there's also that really violent and jealous and vengeful side of Venus that traditionally was there. Like when you go back to the stories of Ishtar, she was a tough cookie.
Right.
Definitely not someone to mess with. So yeah, you get both of those sides with the Empress, and also with the High Priestess, you get that one side that's sort of very giving you a lot of knowledge, but also there's sort of a dark, moody kind of a side to that too. No, so it's not all good. You can't. You have to be real careful when you start using any kind of moral adjectives for these cards, because these cards are definitely beyond any kind of ethics.
Right. So that moves us over to the Lovers. Now, what does this tend to represent as an archetype?
Yeah, I see this as it's the unification. So if you think of him, the masculine side, as the Emperor and the Hierophant, and the feminine as the Empress and the High Priestess, this is where it all comes together. It's the reunification. And I think when we think of the Lovers, when we think of 2 lovers, that is what's going on. That in itself is an archetype, the Lovers, right?
Yeah.
That sense of that mystery of the unification of the masculine and the feminine. They come back together again. And in the Fool's Journey, that's when all of these parts that are separated, they come back together again in the Lovers. And that's a crucial part of any person's psychological development, is being able to integrate those different parts. When one part is pushed down, generally, you're going to get some problems.
True. That is very true. And then that moves into the Chariot.
Now, the Chariot is clearly, I think, that the whole Platonic idea of the allegory of the chariot. And that's really important in the film. So from the Platonic standpoint, there were 3 parts to the soul. You had the charioteer, and then you had the dark horse or the black horse that wanted to go to earth. That would be the horse of the appetites. And then you had the white horse, the horse of sort of the spiritual passions that wants to go to heaven. And the charioteer's got to manage those 2 forces. You could think of those 2 horses as the cross, one the vertical and one the horizontal. The dark horse would be the horizontal, and the vertical would be the white horse. And bringing those together and managing those is crucial. Now, in the myth, the gods ride around on their horses, but they have two horses that want to go to heaven, two white horses. But man has to deal with one horse that wants to go to earth and one wants to go to heaven. So you have to find that balance. So that's crucial from a Platonic standpoint. Controlling those three, the charioteer, that's associated with reason, the black horse, which is associated with the appetites, and the white horse with the passions. And that's when you get into the sort of, the Platonic ideas of justice and temperance and whatnot. The Platonic virtues.
Okay. All right. And the next one down is strength.
Right. So now we're on the psychic level. So we've moved beyond I think in the film I use that scene from Goodfellas where he goes into the, you remember that scene in Goodfellas where he goes into the restaurant and he's tipping all the guys. That's when you're in full control of the material plane. Once you get to the strength card, now we're beginning to separate. It's not all about the body and the ego. There's something else going on, sort of that you're starting to get in touch with the soul. And that's why, and of course, strength represents the whole Platonic ideals of, there was four of them, no? Fortitude, justice, wisdom, and temperance. And so that would be the first one. Now, this card, there's a lot of controversy about this card because it's been switched with justice. So, for example, in the Marseille deck, that spot, which is the 8th card, is justice. And Waite switched it. He switched it to strength. A lot of people, there's a lot of controversy about this. It seems like he did it because he associated strength with the sign of Leo and justice with Libra. So he wanted to maintain the zodiacal order. But the important things these are the 4 cardinal virtues, no? So in my feeling is, as long as they're all there on that plane, on that second psychic plane, three of the 4 virtues, it doesn't really make that much difference.
Right.
But it's difficult. When I was making the film, I was about to switch. But I said, what? Yeah, I was almost about to switch, and I said, you know what? Simple is usually better.
All right, and I think Crowley changed strength to lust, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, okay, right. I
think that might have been one of his changes.
Right, yeah. Mm-hmm. Could be.
And I don't think the definition was drastically different. It was just that he felt that was, a better fit for what he thought the cards meant.
But, it's important because when we think about fortitude, fortitude is not so much controlling. See, I would see controlling lust, like that sort of strength, that might be more temperance, at least in the classical view. Strength, that kind of fortitude, is more about, for example, I use the example of Jesus with Barabbas. And Barabbas is like, wow, we got to go out and kill him. And Jesus says to him, you're blinded by your zeal.
Right.
So fortitude there is controlling those higher sort of impulses. The impulse to justice, for example, the whole social justice warrior movement. A lot of that is, what they might need is a little bit of strength to kind of, reel it in a little bit. You know what I mean? Because you can get carried away with that, or with the environment. Some people just get really carried away with the environment, but you've got to reel it in a little bit.
I take that back. He actually replaced it with adjustment.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, actually, adjustment would fit more with strength.
Yeah. So that's what he replaced. He replaced adjustment with strength.
And what did he replace? What did he put in the for justice? So it goes 7, 8, 9, the 10 card.
So the 10 card he has the Wheel of Fortune.
Okay, then the 11 would be justice.
Lust. That would be lust.
Ah, okay. So I think what he did was he switched. He put justice. He went back to the Marseille style. So he put justice where strength is, and that's what, and that's what. It makes more sense that way, I think.
Okay.
Do you have you ever done readings? I mean,
yes, yeah. I have a Thoth deck. That's the only thing I use.
Oh, okay.
So I'm more familiar with that one, but I'm also fascinated by the differences between the decks. You know.
Right. Yeah. And what kind of spread do you use?
I do whatever I feel.
Okay.
I've always been more of a chaos magician with this stuff. Before I even knew what that was. So to me, it's like, okay, I feel like I'm going to draw 4 cards and I'll put them in this arrangement.
Right. You just kind of let it go out as you feel. Yeah, sure.
And it tends to be decently accurate.
You know, the tarot, the accuracy of the tarot is, because I've done literally thousands of readings now. It's astonishing. It almost never ceases to surprise me. And I've done so many readings. You think at some point you would get even more than astrology. Because astrology, sometimes there's so many variables that it's a little bit easy to get confused when you're reading a chart. Mm-hmm. There's so much in a chart, but astrology it's just amazing sometimes.
I think with tarot though, especially if you're doing a reading for yourself, you can kind of, I mean, if you're open to it, you can kind of understand what the cards mean. So the cards don't have to be exact, because somewhere in your head you kind of also know what you're dealing with. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So you can interpret them properly.
That's one issue I have. I really don't like to read for myself, because the few times I have, I realize sometimes I got very extreme answers. Almost like I got the answer sometimes there's a sense, just when you're reading for somebody, you kind of know what cards are going to come. Like, I have a general sense what cards are going to come. I mean, not all the time, but I have a pretty good idea. You can just feel them, and you feel, okay, now I see where this is going. It's pretty rare that I get a big surprise at the end. But when I read for myself, it just scares me too much. I have a feeling I'm playing with myself. It's like me and myself, and we're playing this game, and it makes me nervous.
I look at it as I need to understand what I'm dealing with currently that I might be missing, as well as what I need to prepare for.
Yeah, that's a great way to do it. If you're going to do a reading for yourself, it's exactly like, what do I need to prepare for? But not about making decisions. I think if you have a real dilemma, I would ask somebody else to do the reading. But yeah, if you're just kind of expecting, all right, what's coming? Yeah, that's because then you're not really pushing your ego too much in it,
Yeah. And why do you think they work? I mean, as a divination tool.
No, well, I mean, that goes back to divination itself, because let's face it, all divination works. It doesn't matter what you use. I really don't think it makes any difference. I mean, people who use runes, or they use tarot cards, you can use astrology to do divination. The Chinese used what did they use? Turtle shells.
Oh, yeah.
They would burn the turtle shell, and the way it cracked, that's how they would read it. So all divination worked. My grandmother used to read tea leaves, I remember. She would just grab your cup and say, So it works. And when people say, well, how do you know it works? If a human artifact if something's been happening, probably as long as there's been language, there's been divination. I don't think there's any culture ever discovered, any human culture, that didn't have some form of divination. So humans have, almost all human cultures use it, and they've used it forever. And people say, oh, well, now we're a scientific culture, we don't use it. Yeah, take a walk down the street, you'll see tarot readers, astrologers, galore. So one thing I think we know it kind of works. How it works, I fall back on the Jungian idea of it's a synchronicity. It's a meaningful coincidence between the question and the moment. So the universe at this moment You ask a question and you do a spread, and there's a coincidence between that question, the spread, and the moment of time. And that's that's people who've had synchronicities in their life, I think when you've had enough of them, you realize, well, there are meaningful coincidences in life. And I see a tarot reading as sort of a forced, meaningful coincidence. It's like we're trying to force it. We're trying to make it happen. And usually something interesting will come up.
Okay. Do you think there are ever outside influences to it?
Well, I mean, if you think about the idea of synchronicity, I mean, half of it is definitely an outside influence,
Fair enough. But I mean, there are people who would attribute tarot readings to spirits too.
Yeah, but I see the whole concept of spirit, as a metaphor for something. Okay. I mean, there are some people who will say, well, yes, there are entities, and these entities have a real existence. Okay, maybe. But I mean, for example, take the UFO phenomenon. It's so complicated and so bizarre when you really get into it. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. It's just absolutely bizarre. I mean, it's definitely there. You can't deny that it's there. And some of the true UFO stories are some of the strangest stories you'll ever hear. I mean, have you heard that one where they get out and they make pancakes?
Oh yeah.
Just bizarre stuff. So are those real entity, that guy who got out and made the pancakes? I mean, I believe the guy that, but is that a real entity, or is it something, is it like an archetype, a metaphor? It's
communication from another part of the universe, not necessarily alien, but like another level.
Exactly. Yeah. I think my intuition says it's something like that. It's like we're getting a reflection of something from a higher level. That's why, Patrick Harper's book.
I love Patrick Harper's. That is one of the best books ever.
That's why when people ask me about this, I just say, read his book.
Yeah.
And he's funny too. I mean, the guy's a great writer, but he just did a podcast with the Higher Side Chats.
Yeah,
it was really good. I love that guy.
I had him on first year. I was shocked that no one had ever had him on before.
Oh, I listened to that interview because I remember looking for, and there's so few interviews. Yeah. I listened to that. That was a great interview.
Yeah, he had actually told, I said, why don't you do other shows? He's like, no one's ever asked.
Oh my, that's because there's so many jackasses out there just full of shit. And you get a guy like this, I mean,
yeah.
Including myself, it'd probably be better if he did some of the podcasts I did.
Actually, we're talking to him currently to bring him back on the show.
Oh, that's great. That's somebody that I think, because, when a lot of people ask me, what's the best tarot book to read? Most tarot books are just nonsense. Read Patrick Harper's book, and you'll get a sense of the other world. And then once you see what's going on with the tarot, he'll help you more than any of these cookbooks. Watch my film.
I think that, your film, I will say your film is very well done. It's long. So people should be warned about that. It's about 2 hours and 45 minutes.
Right.
But it is free on YouTube.
Yeah. I'm not charging for it.
Patrick Harper's Demonic Reality, I think, is one of the most complete ideas of what is going on in reality and the paranormal that I've ever come across.
I've never found anything better.
Yeah. It's like he may not have solved it, but he's probably the closest.
And the thing is, when you try and solve it, he has that humility of saying, what the heck's going on here? But when you get these people tell you, oh, well, it's definitely a being and it's from this planet. And, he told me that, we all should hold hands and sing Kumbaya. No, that's not how it works. It's not that simple.
I think when I did have him on, the first thing he said is, he looked into the UFO thing, figured he'd spend a few days looking into it and figure it out. And then, he said something like, and here we are 20 years later, and I still have no idea what's going on.
Yeah. And that's the beauty of it, the wonder of it. Because, I'm a big fan of Jacques Vallée too. And their work really kind of connects, because Vallée always says that too. He says, it's so damn weird when you read the real unedited, what happened. it's just so bizarre. And that's why Harper, I think, really takes the right path.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get back into what you're talking about.
Oh, we're
though.
Oh, yeah, we're back at the card. Where were we? We were
up to the Hermit, I believe.
Yeah,
yes.
okay. So the Hermit, you think about it, you're on the psychic level. With the Hermit, you want to begin to look inward, introspection. I think of the Hermit a little bit as the sadhu in India, who, at 50, they kind of go off on their own, smoke weed all day and meditate. That's that you got to move that. You got to start looking inward. And then the Wheel of Fortune is a key card, because now the Wheel of Fortune, especially for the tarot readers out there, for me making this film, it was kind of something I learned. One of the key things I learned. The fortune was always considered evil. She was not your friend. The Wheel of Fortune was not your friend. This was something, she's going to bring you. Yeah, she might bring you some good things, but eventually she's going to bring you the bad. But when we do readings, the Wheel of Fortune is generally considered a really good card. But traditionally, it does have a very strong negative kind of feel to it. And so what the Wheel of Fortune really is separating yourself from your destiny. If you completely identify with your destiny, you're really stuck in the material world. But if you can kind of separate it, it's a little bit that kind of Buddhist concept of Maya.
Right.
It's separating yourself from, or the Hindu idea, that idea where I am not what my destiny is, and I'm not my circumstances. And that's an important moment in a person's development. A lot of people never get past that. They are always identifying with their circumstances. And that's not who we are. Then, after that, then you reach justice. And the justice card is a very profound card. And this definitely goes back to the whole Platonic idea of living the just life. So, if we look at the 4 classical virtues, I just want to explain this because I think it's important. When you go back to that chariot, the charioteer of reason needs wisdom. Reason without wisdom can get us in a lot of trouble. The appetites, the physical appetites, they need temperance. And the spiritual passions, they need fortitude, they need strength. When you combine those, then you lead the just life. So justice means really reaching that moment when you're really living your life in balance. Everything is kind of under control. It's a complex idea, but when you go into Plato, you can't underestimate how important Plato was in the Hellenistic world. Plato was the book. It's like we might think of the Bible, and that time it was Plato. And all of these ideas, they were very, very influential all the way through the Renaissance. So once you get to that point, you've basically, you're living a life on the physical realm. You've dominated that level. On the psychic level, you've controlled the passions. You've looked inward. You've separated yourself from your circumstances. You're living the just life. The Hanged Man is a fascinating card. That's when you take the red pill. That's in the Matrix when he takes the red pill. That's when everything just gets flipped. I mean, it's such a profound card. It's seeing the world upside down. Because how many people who kind of get on these spiritual paths or whatever, there's a point where they wake up and they're like, oh my God, everything I've been taught, everything I thought I believed, it's all wrong. Mm-hmm. That's the hangman. Now, it's interesting. The origins of the hangman in the Renaissance, it was political graffiti. So when you wanted to, basically insult a politician, you would paint him upside down, hung upside down. Huh. It was like a shame painting. Or if you were a traitor in a political, let's say in some sort of political scheming, you didn't fight or you didn't support who you're supposed to support, they would paint you that way. And there is an element of shame in that whole waking up process. Like you begin to, the things that you used to believe, there's a certain shame in thinking that they're wrong.
Right.
And that shame is the hangman. That's why it's not a simple card. It's a complex. That's why I don't use any words in that. I just kind of use a lot of images to go through.
It would also embody the concept of sacrifice as well, wouldn't it? As in sacrificing your beliefs, the way you thought everything was?
Sacrifice. Yeah, but the only thing is I would push back a little bit on that because that goes to sort of a Christian idea of the cross as sacrifice.
Fair enough.
And I think that the cards are more Gnostics. And remember, the Gnostics were very much against that idea of a physical Christ being sacrificed for something. They rejected that completely.
Okay.
Even the Cathars had never used the image of a crucifix. It was anathema to them. So there could be, I see what you mean. There could be some of that, like sacrificing your old ideas.
Yeah.
But for what? Yeah, maybe. But that's a tough card.
Yeah.
And when you get that in a reading, it's not easy, but because it's showing things beginning to kind of spin around, but it's not a happy moment.
And that brings us to death.
Death is a really easy one because when you begin to open up, when you begin to kind of see things, you change, your old self dies, and you got to let that happen. And then you get to temperance. And temperance, because once you have that hangman experience and you allow the old self to die, temperance is the antidote to the inflation. So a lot of people, when they first kind of get it, they kind of begin to wake up, they become really inflated. They know everything. They begin to explain everything: chemistry, physics, quantum physics, the world economy. Yeah, I'm sure you've met people like that now.
Sure.
And the thing is, we've all been there. I was there. I remember I've said a lot of stupid shit and wrote a lot of stupid shit, because I thought I know everything. And then you're like, oh my God, you go back and read it. It's like, Jesus, what the fuck, But you know what I mean? That you get to that point and you need temperance. And the temperate card is beautiful because she has 1 foot in the water and 1 on earth. It's that balance. And you gotta stay grounded. And
that is what Crowley replaced with art.
Right. And I love that because in my film, I use that part from Moyer's interview with Campbell. Mm-hmm. I use the part where Campbell talks about the epiphany, because the epiphany comes when the artist finds that perfect balance between straight and crooked, dark and light. It's a very difficult thing to achieve, but when you achieve it, there's real insight and it's art. So temperance is fundamental, I think, in art.
And then we move on to the devil.
Then now we're on the third level. We're on the spiritual level. And I see the devil as entirely our shadows. I'm not a person. I don't see this idea of evil as an entity. There's actual true evil. I see evil as pure, the extreme of the material plane, but it's also psychologically, it's our shadows. So with the devil, you've got to come to terms with your shadow.
Yeah, in the documentary, I think you kind of suggest it's like projecting your worst sides out there to deal with them. Right. Exactly. Yeah. I use a couple film clips, and even I use that famous clip from what was the name? True Detective. Oh yeah. You remember when Rust begins going off on, we're humanity, it's an accident and all this. That's that narcissistic kind of shadow a lot of people have. They get lost in that. They think, oh, this is, there's a certain narcissism in there that you've really got to look in the mirror and come to terms with. And, there's a lot of different ways it could be, whatever it is. Our shadows can be, but you've got to come to current terms with them. And I don't think it's so much overcoming them. I don't think it's like you have to become some kind of a saint, but I think you really do have to come to terms with, what it is and try and integrate it at least a little bit. Yeah, you have to acknowledge it. Yeah. No one's perfect. I mean, We all have our bad elements.
Yeah, and I mean, for example, take somebody who's violent. There's a lot of, we're all to some extent violent, but there's some people who are extremely violent and they lose control, and it's definitely their shadow, no?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Coming to terms with the fact that somebody is, excessively violent and trying to just somehow integrate it somehow into their personalities in a way that makes it less dangerous. That would be a way of coming to terms with the shadow. It's not meaning that the person's never going to have those violent tendencies, but at least they come to terms with them.
Well, I would think with someone like that, it might be that they get violent because they don't like things that conflict with their belief system. They don't like being challenged. They don't, and coming to terms with that would then reduce that violent instinct.
Yeah. But for example, imagine somebody who was passive aggressive. So instead of getting violent, they become passive aggressive. It's the same thing. You know what I mean? You gotta integrate those things in a sense. But is violence always so bad? Well, not necessarily. I mean, sometimes we need it, right? I mean, if you're defending your family or your country or whatever, sometimes we need it. So
I kind of go with that. Violence is never the answer, but sometimes it's unfortunately necessary.
Right. I mean, we're humans, and we're by nature violent.
It's a violent world, unfortunately.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean we shouldn't find other options, but sometimes we're forced into that one.
And I really think that the devil is there's a problem in a modern society, especially today, where there's a lot of people who can't accept the shadow side of our natures. So they feel guilt, constant guilt about who they are and their history and what their ancestors have done. And it's just this massive guilt trip saying, I'm such a good person. How could I be a member of a group who did these horrible things? And, I feel like telling them, honey, you're not that good a person. Trust me. If I put you in the right circumstances, you'd be as nasty as the next guy. You know what I mean? And you need that. That's part of who you are.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, that's that contrast, that duality.
Exactly. And that's the interesting thing about the tarot. It's constantly just hammering at the duality, which is so Gnostic.
And that brings us to the Tower.
The Tower is when it all collapses. That's when all the dogma. Now remember, the opposite card, if you line the cards up, the opposite card of the Tower, it's really interesting, is the Hierophant. So all of that dogma from the Hierophant just gets blown away. It's all gone. The Tower is the dark night of the soul. Mm-hmm. It's because, there's that euphoria when you kind of wake up and you're like, oh, this is all fantastic. And, oh, this is great. And then, eventually it's not so great. And you've got to pass through that. You've got to go through that dark night of the soul.
Your
all
attention
got to.
is required.
If you haven't been there, it's coming. And it's a dark place because it's just all just gone. Even your faith in yourself and it just collapses. And out of those ashes comes the star.
And that loss of faith too is one of the hardest things to deal with.
Oh yeah. It's brutal.
Yeah.
It's a terrible thing. And it's not just loss of faith, say, in a religious faith, but it can be faith in family.
In everything.
In everything. And I mean, I have a feeling you're probably similar to me that, I remember reading New York Times and just think that was my great favorite part of the day. Get my coffees, a couple cigarettes, read the New York Times. I was like, oh, this is wonderful. I know what's going on in the world. Now I look at it and it's just torture. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And to think, God, and it was difficult to think this is all not true.
Yep.
And it's tough. It's really tough to just disconnect from all those things. You have to mourn those things. You can't just let things go. There has to be a period of pain and suffering, and that's the Tower. Tower's a tough card. And in a reading, it's a very difficult card.
Yeah, yeah. And that brings us into the Star.
So here we can go through the three luminaries.
All
you
right.
get the faintest star. And I associate the star a lot with the Gnostic Sophia in the film. And then you get to the moon and the sun, which would be really the mother and father of the Fool. So the moon is, I love them. The moon card's maybe one of my favorite cards. You know, the two towers and that lobster thing moving up, and you see the moon sort of dripping. It's a beautiful card. It's like something's emerging. And I actually use a Valentinian text, Summer Harvest. Well, actually, I use that in the sun. But in that text, it talks about, you know, something emerging from the bottom. It's like something's beginning to emerge. And then just remember, when we go back from the death card all the way to the moon, it's night. And you see that in the cards.
Yeah.
It's death. You're in that period of death. But in the sun card, the Fool's born again. And remember, from the star, there's no clothes. If you see in the tower, they have clothes on, but from the star, there are no clothes. She's nude, and then the moon is, there's no people, and then you get to the sun, and it's just a newborn baby on a horse. And that's the Fool being born again. That's a beautiful card, the sun card.
And then that brings us to the last two.
Right, and Judgment. Judgment's a difficult card, but I associate it a lot with fire. And that is kind of a traditional association with Judgment. But the fire that burns everything, that burns time away. So that
cleanses.
That illusion of time, that curtain of time just gets blown away. And I use in the film, it's who is it? It's Shiva with the sword in one hand, and he has that click in the other. It's
the drum,
famous, right, with the drum of time and the sword with the flames, that cuts through it. So once you get to Judgment, the veil is completely burned away, and then you get to the world, and the world is clearly Christ. That's the famous, the Vesica Pisces with the four. That's a very famous image of Christ. That they had to remove Christ and put a woman in because you can't put Christ on a playing card.
Right.
But that's just a classic image of the Vesica Pisces with Jesus inside, and you have the four fixed signs of the zodiac. That exact image is the image. I believe it's in Chart, no? Where you have that image there. So that's a clear reference to sort of, but not the Jesus kind of thing. It's that Christ consciousness, right?
Yeah.
You've broken through. You've made it.
And those last two, Crowley changed it all. He changed as well. He changed the Judgment to the Aeon, which was his own personal sort of thing. And then he changed the world to the universe. I mean, the symbols and stuff don't change a huge amount on the cards, but he just changed the names.
Right. But does he in the Crowley world universe? Are there the four fixed signs?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So he basically he maintains. Does he keep that oval shape, the Vesica Pisces?
Yep.
Because that's crucial. The two circles that come together. So out of the two emerges the three. Emerges the third. So you get the whole Trinity in that. That's a really from geometry and whatnot. That's a really important symbol.
It looks a lot more sci-fi-ish on his cards sometimes.
Yeah.
The way they're presented, Even for the time period.
Well, one question. When were those cards made? When were they painted?
Oh, 1920s, I think.
Oh, okay. All right. Because he was actually a painter himself. I know he did a lot. There was periods where he painted, and I think he tried to sell some of his paintings.
Yeah, but he didn't do the cards. I think he designed the ideas around the cards, and was it Layla that did the cards? I'd have to look it up.
Yeah, I don't really know that much about how he came out with the cards, but I remember there was a story where it took a long time for him for those cards to get out.
Oh, Frida Harris did them.
Oh, okay. Yeah, the imagery is very different. I think that the Crowley imagery seems a little bit more modern, maybe, but it also seems, in my opinion, it seems a little bit more dated.
Well,
The Coleman Smith images, I mean, if you saw those today, you wouldn't say, oh well, these are 100 years old. I mean, she was a very talented illustrator. She did a really good job on those.
It says Crowley originally intended the Thoth deck to be a 6-month project aimed at updating the traditional pictorial system of the tarot. However, due to the increased scope of the project, eventually spanned 5 years between 1938 and 1943, and both artists died before publication in 1969 by the Ordo Templi Orientis. Crowley and Harris painted some of the cards as many as 8 times.
Wow, so the OTO didn't publish them till 1969.
No, I didn't realize that.
Wow. Yeah. And he worked on some of the imagery?
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, I know he put a lot of the imagery in there. Because he liked to combine all the esoteric imagery into like one system.
Mm-hmm.
So when you look at the cards, I'm looking at them as you're describing the Rider-Waite deck, and the imagery's all there. It's changed a little bit, but it's all there. So he kept the tradition.
Stuff is there, yeah.
Right. Like with the world card, you have the 4, stations of on the corners of the cards. It says the current edition of U.S. Game Systems deck has 2 prototypes by Lady Harris, but then rejected by Crowley. In 1977, Harris's paintings were rephotographed as for a second edition, and further revisions followed in 86 and 96.
Wow.
But he also connected everything to the Kabbalah, to the Hebrew alphabet, to all this, everything he could possibly connect them, because he had that whole book of correspondences. 777, where he tries to connect every magical system and every ancient writing and so on and so forth and put them all together.
I mean, I should be clear. I really reject all the connections to the Kabbalah. I think it's just pure coincidence that you had 22 cards and the 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet and the 22 connections and the 22 connections to the Sephiroth. I think it's just pure coincidence. Because it's not something I came at easily. I spent literally months trying to because I in the film, I think I create a coherent path. You might not agree with it, but it's coherent. It makes sense.
Very.
And I spent months because I originally believed that. I said, well, okay, it's got to be. So I really went into the Kabbalah and I tried to create like the path I've laid out here through the Sephiroth, and it made no sense. I just got confused. And then I went back and I looked at it and I was like, this was probably a coincidence that people paid too much attention to. And because if you go back to Renaissance Italy, that time in Italy, the influence I think would be much stronger from the Cathars and from alchemy than it would be from the Kabbalah. Remember, the Kabbalah emerges in Spain in the 12th, 13th century? In like Leon and Girona, in those cities in Spain, the major texts of the Kabbalah. So I don't see it. And Gershom Scholem was adamant that there was no connection. So I don't see it. And in the film, I don't go into that because to me, it doesn't really make sense. That's just my feeling.
Yeah, I can understand that. I think the concept is similar though, where it's kind of trying to show you the path through reality. In a way.
Oh, absolutely.
You have that same duality happening from Kether down as it separates out, and then you get phenomenal existence below it.
Right.
But yeah, it's even if it doesn't match up, it seems like it has a similar path.
Yeah, and I would say the same for the Zodiac, that there was any association to the Zodiac. But I don't use the Kabbalah in the film, but I do use the Zodiac because certain cards, seems to be like a nice association with them. They kind of fit, like Justice with Libra. This kind of fits nicely there. But I don't think this was an original intention of the people who created the major arcana. Though go ahead.
Do you think that they created the major arcana and then it was altered to kind of tell this story as time went on?
That's a really good question. Yes. So the major arcana, for example, originally there were no numbers. And now there's kind of a debate. There was no devil card, and I don't believe there was a tower card either in the Visconti deck. So eventually you get the devil and you get the tower card. Was there originally one? That's not clear. But By the time the tarot reaches France, where it's just a wildly popular, people have to remember this, it was a wildly popular game that people played when it arrived in France. By the time you get to the Marseille deck, you get numbers on the cards and you get the devil in the tower. So I think it's a little bit like the archetypes emerge. They're always there, like the Kabbalah, like the Zodiac, and they get tweaked. And I do believe when they get tweaked, sometimes they get tweaked for the better. Because maybe the original one didn't quite fit. It was almost there, and a couple tweaks here and a couple tweaks there. You know what I mean? It's an ongoing process.
It can also be a way to hide sort of esoteric knowledge right in plain sight.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things I try and insinuate, that the Cathars were burned to death. I mean, burned on the stake, literally.
Yeah.
Thousands of them. So when you get to the 14th century, beginning of the 15th century, in that period, it would make sense to hide these things in something that's just a game. Yeah. Because, when you look at the world card, that's clearly Christ. I mean, anyone who knows anything about the history of art says, oh, well, that's obviously Christ with the four Gospels. But they put a woman in because you can't put Christ on a playing card. So, I mean, it's obviously going on. They're obviously hiding certain things. Clearly, there's no doubt about certain things being hidden. I'd like to think that, but I think the cards are so powerful, we don't need to go into woo-woo fantasy land. It's there. When you look at it, it's there. How it got there, because some people I think it's actually a materialist view. I really believe when people say it has to come from ancient Egypt. Why? I mean, if you believe in these forms, why does it have to come from ancient Egypt, right? Why can't it just appear? Right. It's a certain, like, if it doesn't come from there, it's not authentic. Yeah. I think there's a sort of scientism, materialism kind of thing going on there. You know what I mean?
And I think Crowley asserted that they came from Egypt as well, but I think that was the common belief at the time.
But Crowley was Crowley was someone who was just full of mythology. He understood the power of mythology. So, to say they came from Egypt, he was speaking, I don't think he was speaking as literally as people think he was.
That could be. But you also said the playing card system did come from Egypt, correct?
Oh no, that game definitely came from Egypt. There's no doubt about that.
And what was the era that dates back to?
Right, that would be the Mamluks. Yeah, so that game left Egypt and got to Europe, say 1200s, 1300s, and the Mamluks had been there. The Mamluks are fascinating. They were actually from the Caucasus. They were mercenaries that were brought to Egypt to fight, and they eventually took over. So they actually have Aryan origin in the Caucasus.
So let's talk about the documentary itself a little bit. You have it, it's about 2 hours and 45 minutes long, and you have it in a full form, but you also have it kind of serialized on YouTube as well. Why did you decide to do it that way?
Yeah, so just to explain the structure of the documentary, there are 5 introductory sections. So it's just a simple introduction. Then I go into the origins of the cards, the archetypes, duality, and the structure of the cards. And then I hit each card. So there's 22 cards in the major arcana. So that's 27 parts. So I made the film in one version. You can watch the thing. You can watch it straight through. And then I separated it out. So you can just go part by part, the 27 sections. So on my website, on the YouTube channel, you can see it. There's a playlist where you have the 27 sections, or you can just watch the whole film. And there are subtitles. So that was a big project. We did the subtitles in Russian, in Spanish, and actually in Chinese.
Oh, wow. Okay. I did not realize that.
Yeah. So if there are folks that would prefer, or if you have friends who, don't speak English but speak Spanish, the subtitles are in Spanish, Russian, or because I worked in China. So my old university where I worked, I got some of my old students together, and it was and interestingly, the film's been banned in China.
Really? Why?
So interesting because the feedback was vulgarity, nudity, and then some sections they just said that this can't be shown. So there's a couple parts that they said you just can't show this in China. But then they knocked, I think 22 of them were basically banned. So for example, The World, I think it was basically because it shows a breast.
I'm surprised YouTube hasn't freaked out yet.
Oh my God. Yeah, I was pretty careful. I guess the only place I get a little dodgy is in the archetypes.
Mm-hmm.
And very interesting, I showed that in Berlin. I was at a conference in Berlin, the Berlin Occulture, and I showed the section of, you heard about that? It was a great conference. We had a lot of fun. And I showed the section on archetypes. And I was a little, I think I'm in Berlin, and I kind of go into, Leni Riefenstahl and the Munich rallies and all that. Some people have gotten a little bit of annoyed because, I kind of go after Putin, but I also go after Obama. So I pissed them all off.
How long did it take you to put this together?
About 3 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was a long project. Yeah.
I can imagine. You use a lot of movie clips and stuff to kind of illustrate the concepts of the archetypes. Obviously, the Matrix pops up a bunch of times. Right. You haven't had any issues with copyrights for using. I mean, it would be fair use, I would think, but that doesn't seem to stop YouTube from, going after things.
Well, I want to talk about this because we're at an interesting moment because I studied film in the 1980s. So I spent a year in film school, so I know a little bit about film. If I wanted to make this film in the 1980s, it would have taken probably 6 or 7 years.
Oh, yeah.
And probably maybe because remember, I would have had the, editing rooms and cameras. And, when you remember in the 1980s, when you wanted to take an image and put it on film, you had to film the image. So if you were using video, you'd have the video camera, or if you're using, say, 16 millimeter, you'd actually have to film the image and then put it into the film. So that's money. So if I wanted to make this film in the 1980s, it would probably cost me $50,000. And imagine the copyright issues. But YouTube, I know we love to bash YouTube, but one interesting thing that YouTube has done is it's enabled creative folks like me to be able to deal with the copyright holders. So basically, all the copyright holders are monetizing the film. So I'm not making any money off this. They are. But I get to, which is fine because it's not like we're talking about any serious amount of money. But I get to use the films I loved. I'm a film buff. So I get to use great music, great films, and put it together. And what do I give up? Okay. What are we talking about in YouTube ad revenue? A couple $1,000? Who cares? So, I mean, it really is for creative people. There's a lot of opportunity now to play because YouTube is so powerful. They've been able to make agreements with all of these copyright holders. So you can use a lot of fabulous material and do some really interesting stuff. And I don't think people are taking advantage of it.
Well, some people are. Some people definitely are. But I was just wondering if you had issues with that. Because, I mean, YouTube, because of this type of technology, because of how easy it is to do, YouTube kind of sits in that position where they're trying to make both sides happy. They're trying to give creators as much freedom as possible, but they also don't want the legal problems with the big corporate entities.
I would say this. On the music side, it's very clear. You just go into that YouTube library and they tell you, you can use it, but, we get to monetize. With video, it's a little bit dodgier. What I would recommend folks do, if you want to use a section of a film, take the piece of film, cut it, put it on your channel, but don't put it as private, and leave it there for a day or two. And if there's a copyright issue, you won't get a strike. Yeah, you won't get a strike. It'll just say you can't use this video, and you just take it down. But you won't get a strike. You won't get a strike. Yeah. So just test it, and a lot of times you'll see. So there'll be a copyright claim, and then they'll say, but the owner of the copyright wants to monetize. Fine, then you can use it. So that's what I did. I would just test and test and test. With video, it's not so clear, but with the music, it's very clear in their library what you can use and what you can't.
Okay. And what is your YouTube channel?
Oh, geez, what's the name of it? I think it's Robert Bonomo Cactus Land, because my blog is Cactus Land. But just put in the 21 Faces. The name of the film is The 21 Faces of God. So just put in the 21 Faces of God into YouTube, and you'll get there.
Yeah, I'm pulling up your channel now, and it's not telling. Yeah, it just says Robert Bonomo.
Okay, cool.
But yeah, and your blog is thecactusland.com. Why is it called The Cactus Land?
Because that was my, which novel? The third novel. That comes from the poem The Wasteland from T.S. Eliot. This is the dead land.
Okay.
This is the cactus land. You know. So yeah,
Okay.
that was the title of my novel. So that's the name of my blog. That's kind of my brand.
Do you plan on doing anything else on the tarot?
I'm not sure. I could possibly do something shorter on the minor arcana, and then say like an hour. And then maybe I could do something like an hour and a half on divination itself. So what is divination? How does it work? And then just like how to do a Celtic cross spread. But I'm not sure I want to. I just don't know. I'm just kind of debating it.
So no book or anything that's going to eventually accompany the documentary?
I don't think so. I think it holds up pretty well. I mean, I don't think it needs if you're really into the tarot, it's a dense film. So I mean, if you watch it seriously, the people who've really gotten into it, and I've got some really good feedback. I mean, they've watched it a couple times to really kind of get the whole. There's a lot of information here on astrology, on alchemy, and then if you love film, I mean, I use clips from just lots of really interesting films, a lot of French films, and all sorts of stuff. And
I definitely enjoyed it. Like I said, the only thing that threw me is it was a lot longer than I was expecting, because I was looking at it initially in parts.
Right. No, definitely, yeah.
So, but the fact that you have it broken up into parts makes it easy for people to kind of just go through in pieces too, if they want to.
Yeah, and that might actually be a better way to do it. If you're really into the tarot, it might be better just to go in parts, kind of lay out the cards and just kind of watch the sections and try and get the feel. Because this is one thing. Who's that? There was an astrologer. His name's escaping me. Dane. The name's escaping me. But a very famous astrologer who talked about you can't understand the zodiac sign by sign. You have to understand the path of the zodiac, the seasons. And the cards are the same way. You can't really understand the cards until you understand their place in the path, what's before them, what's after them. So, learning the cards is something that you have to take contextually, not just individually.
All right. Well, I thank you for spending some time with us talking about this. And it's very cool that you have it up free on YouTube for people to check out. Anything else that people should know?
No, I think that's it. If you want to check the film out, it's the 21 Faces of God. It's in YouTube with subtitles. And if you're interested in some of my articles and things, it's thecactusland.com.
Where Did the Road Go would not be what it is without help from our Patreons. And a special shout out to those pledging $10 or more: Allison Cook, Super Inframan, Andy McNamara, Charles Beauregard, Craig Cisternos, Jose A., Scott Morris Everett, Robert Groom, Roland Belstead, Savannah Barlow, Riker and Stark, Sean Cosgrove, Eric Citron, Russell Wilcoxon, Sasha Lord, Christopher Vaughn, Ben Crow, Carla Mahoney, John Eddy, Chris, Jack Bishop, Mark Brady, William Lovelace, Patricia Giaquinta, Kevin Schreck, Alex Bowes, and Alfred Tuttle. Thank you all so much. Okay, as I said, there's an extra segment with Robert. We talk about his blog, a little less about the tarot, a little more about some of the stuff he has blogged about. So if you're a patron, you'll have that. And if you want to become a patron, go to wheredidtheroadgo.com, and there's a link to Patreon right on there. See you next time. You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons. And we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can always find everything Where Did the Road Go related at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And thank you so much for your support.